Hello and welcome back to another edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today on Tuesday, April 26th. It's also a great pleasure to have four special guests with us today who are here to tell us a little bit about the Southern Vermont Economy Summit meeting that's going to be occurring over in Dover, Vermont at Mount Snow on May 12th. So here today to tell us a little bit about what's going to be happening this year at the summit meeting. We're pleased to have with us today Bill Colvin, who is the Assistant Director of and Community Development Program Coordinator of the Bennington County Regional Commission. Jonathan Cooper is the Community and Economic Development Specialist, also with the Bennington County Regional Commission. Meg Staloff is the Project Manager for the Southern Vermont Economy Project. And Jennifer Stromsten is the Director of Programs for the Brattleboro Development Credit Corporation. Just want to thank you all for making the time for our conversation today. Really appreciate you all being here. And Meg, let me start with you, if I may, and just have you tell us a little bit about what's on the agenda for the summit and sort of a general overview of what people who will be going to it will be able to see.
Sure. So as always, it's going to be a terrific and energizing day. Our plan is to both zoom out and look at the big picture of our local regional economy and also provide various tracks where people can dive in a little deeper with subject matter experts. So our keynotes, the zoom out, will both be looking at our Welcoming Communities program with Joe Wea and Thomas Huddleston of ECDC and Multicultural Center in Brattleboro, where they have been working to bring 90 plus Afghan refugees into our community. And so that has been a big effort. People may think, why is that an economy summit? And our answer is it absolutely belongs here. It's really central to the work that we've been doing. As we zoom in, we'll have tracks for people working on welcoming communities and welcoming workplaces. We'll also have a sort of municipal project track for people working in their towns on projects to bring things forward in their community. We'll talk about housing as well. And then we'll also be having special sessions for business owners to really look at kind of the big picture and find ways to move their business forward following the pandemic, and also thinking about business succession as both an opportunity for retiring business owners and younger business owners. At lunchtime, we're going to have kind of another zoom out look at development in our community and kind of talk about how all these things come together to create the change that we want in our community. At the end of the day, we're going to turn it loose for some hardcore networking, question asking, answering with our amazing room full of people, kind of grouping by subject matter and letting people go ask those questions that came up for them during the sessions or the keynote addresses. So I think it should be a really rich day. We're going to have a room full of really amazing people there. That's really the main attraction, is just that chance to get together and learn and leave inspired.
All right. Well, Bill Colvin, let me turn to you. The theme of the summit this year is Cultivate Change. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. What kind of led to that as being the overarching theme of the conference this year?
Great. Thanks very much, Andrew. So, as you detailed the history of the Southern Vermont Economy Summits and looking back to our last in-person event in 2019, I think we can all agree that there has been little other than change in our lives during that intervening time. So it seemed like an obvious thing to embrace. And I think the goal of the summit is really, in cultivating change, is to embrace what change can mean. Yes, it can present challenges and hurdles. It can also present significant opportunity. So I think we're hoping to equip people with tools to take advantage of the opportunities that come about as a result of change. And, at the same time, grounding this summit in the work that we have done across Southern Vermont between Bennington and Windham counties in developing the comprehensive economic development strategy. If you look back to the original Southern Vermont economy report back in 2017, it led off with the recommendation that we need to repopulate Southern Vermont. And as a result of hard work done by people like ECDC and the two organizations that are co-hosting this effort, we're certainly seeing that, both from a refugee perspective, as Meg just mentioned, with the Afghan refugees, both in Windham and Bennington County, significant efforts there. And we saw a significant influx of people as a result of the pandemic, people kind of reevaluating their lives and looking to relocate to more rural areas. And we understand that that has exacerbated what already existed as significant housing pressure. So obviously another key theme grounding the summit. But I think the idea is to equip people, help them understand that change can be scary. Change is also necessary, and change can present opportunities. So hopefully people will come away from the summit on the 12th with the idea that we can embrace that change and some tools to implement successful changes in their municipalities, in their businesses, in their lives.
Okay, well, Jen Stromsten, let me turn to you and have you talk a little bit about, I guess, two of the sessions are going to be led by this gentleman named Daniel Herridges, who is the senior editor and founding member of Strong Towns. And a couple of months ago, I think we had a conversation about Strong Towns. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what's going to be happening with the two sessions he's going to be leading, and how that fits into the whole overall theme of the conference.
Yeah, so we have through the Southern Vermont Economy Project, during COVID, we realized that just doing more and more and more webinars was just going to make people crazy. So, we continued with some of that, but absent the ability to gather people together, which is a lot of how, not only is the summit a thing we do annually, we also often would do smaller conferences, mini conferences, connectivity summits, things that have really helped kind of fuel our economy over the years. One of the pivots that we did was to kind of form this study group. Strong Towns created these curricula, and we convened folks from across the region who got together kind of every couple of weeks. We had a lot of homework, and we would watch these videos and do these readings. It was all curated by, a lot of it delivered by this person from Strong Towns. And it was incredible. It was incredible to spend months with people from across the region, town managers, people working on housing projects, just digging into it, because it gets back to sort of what, Bill was talking about, that we look at these forces around us and we say, the economy happens to us, right? And we actually have to sort of turn that on its head and say, like, it's a thing we can and have to shape. And it's not easy or obvious. And we've been given a lot of tools to stop things, but not a lot of tools or knowledge about how to shape things. And so I think that for me was sort of the biggest takeaway. There's a million things that I learned. And I mean, I'm a person who's been, nerding out about housing for a long time, even before it was popular. And I learned a ton from that, but mostly what I took away from it was, this kind of support for, we can do this. We can find a variety of ways to shape what is happening in our communities, and not just around housing, around all kinds of downtown development. And that extends from all the things we know about and talk about zoning and better zoning, and, things that, allow us to have more density and walkable places, but then kind of through things that are more general and kind of social and cultural, kind of reshaping our attitudes about, what we want and what it's going to take to get there, and who takes part in making it happen. One of the other things related to that Strong Towns work that Daniel Herridges talks about, and we'll probably talk about a lot in his sessions, is the important role of incremental development, that in places like where we live, in rural places and in small towns, it's really this kind of thing of all these different actors, local actors taking part in something. It's not the top down, the big developer comes in and does a giant thing. That's not really healthy or desirable, and it's often not likely anyway. Sometimes you have these big core projects that are essential to that, but 90% of what goes on is going to be me adding an addition to my home. It's going to be my neighbor taking a home and converting it back to a multifamily so they can afford to buy their first home. And so he really goes from those kind of big picture dynamics around what is healthy for communities, from smaller incremental kind of ground up change, to the very kind of nudgy mechanics of like zoning and financing and sort of how those things can get done. So I think the way that he attracts this can speak to anyone, because he's kind of, the polyglot of the local development world. So
That sounds interesting. I mean, housing is certainly a gigantic subject around the state. Certainly down here at our end of the state, and a subject I think I'd like to return to before we finish. But before we go to there, Jonathan, let me bring you into this here. This is going to be the first sort of in-person conference, as Bill was saying, since 2019, and the state as a whole is, well, if we had been having this conversation a month ago, I would have said, well, we're on our way out of the pandemic, but every time I start thinking that, normalcy is right around the corner, another subvariant seems to emerge out of the woodwork. But I just wondered, in general, from your perspective, how do you see Southern Vermont and perhaps the state as a whole coming out of the last couple of years of COVID economics? Are we beginning to see daylight somewhere and some ideas to what the summer tourist season might look like?
Well, so the work of economic development is consistent optimism. So I will say that I really do see a lot of energy formulating around this summer. I feel that we will be seeing a lot of some of those numbers back, that head counts. We can play the license plate game. We can sort of begin to see the wider world returning to Southern Vermont. But to be honest, I think that part of COVID economics will always be, and when we sort of are doing the look backs in however many years it takes before we can have a look back, we'll be sort of saying that this is an opportunity when a lot of places got on the map. And whether we're in sections of Idaho, sections of Michigan, or in northern New England, particularly in Southern Vermont, places that had been sometimes places became all the time places. And that's really, I think, going to be a lasting element. And that's part of why I think when we think about last year's summit, we had a session about how our rural economy participates in the wider global economy. And it was that was a sort of an element that was in the summit then, was giving us a chance to see how are we connected to much broader, bigger economic actors, bigger footprints, and supply chains or action chains that perhaps come as a surprise to us, getting acclimated to our small village centers and downtowns as we have been. And then this summit, we're really looking, we're looking back home, and we're looking sort of inward. And for some people, this is an opportunity to really jump into their new home. In other ways, it's an opportunity for connections to form between some of the stewards and some of the sort of the new hands on deck. That is something that I think when we look at one of the sessions about identifying opportunities, we have a really dynamic panel there, and we'll be hearing from some people that are taking advantage of new opportunities for business and activities that presented themselves through the pandemic, or were simply shepherded along at a faster pace than ordinarily would expect in terms of technological change or of sort of a broader suite of connections. We also see some activities in there, some panels are in there about being a welcoming community, really responding to some of the dynamics that are playing out right now across our towns. And something that I really wanted to just put a point on is, as Jen said, this is something that our economy belongs to all of us, and we have roles to play, not just at the BCRC or at the BDCC. The biggest impacts are those taking place at those individual scales, and really getting a sense that this is in a state where we have a phenomenal level of social services, a phenomenal level of resource protections and conservations. We're having an opportunity to really see that this economy and economic development is in the public interest, and that this is the most empowering part of the summit for us, is that we've maybe gotten a sense of how many levers we have in front of us as a result of the pandemic. And so often with levers of power, we just have to put our hands on them and pull.
How big a deal is it to be a welcoming state to people who, probably hadn't heard of Vermont a year ago?
As I noted way back when we did the first Southern Vermont Economic Development Zone report, we recognized the demographics that you just referenced, Andrew. The two of the oldest counties and the second oldest state in the country, a declining population, a net decline projected to be pretty severe by 2030. And, at the time we were certainly tracking to be more severe than of a population loss even than those dire predictions. So the pandemic upended that a little bit and resulted in a little bit of blip in the population change. But I think in our first ever joint comprehensive economic development strategy, we embraced the idea of immigration as an opportunity to begin to repopulate Southern Vermont. Keep in mind that we did that at a time when there were significant national headwinds against immigration. And it was just, so it was a little more challenging perhaps than might have been expected to put that into a recommendation in our strategy report. You know, lo and behold, the world changes relatively quickly. Administration change in the United States, significant disruption in Afghanistan, and a huge significant group of volunteers across Southern Vermont stepping up to find out what they can do. And, you know, it's really been amazing what's happened both in Windham and Bennington County. Yes, now through ECDC and a, effort with capacity, but also, largely on the backs of volunteers throughout Southern Vermont. And as Meg noted, 90 plus people spread across Southern Vermont. And by all accounts, the reactions are that people are really pleased to be in Vermont, that they have found it to be welcoming. And the news is spreading that Vermont, in fact, is a place where refugees can be welcome. If you'll think back to last year's summit, the virtual one, as you noted, we also were talking about this idea of repopulating Southern Vermont, of being a welcoming place, and we focused heavily on what it meant to be a young professional, perhaps relocating from elsewhere to come to Vermont and live here and work here, and that's another important component. So it's critically important, if we're going to change those population demographics, that we be welcoming to a broad spectrum of the world, and that people feel welcome and wanted and at home here in our communities. It's, as Meg pointed out, is it unusual to have discussions about immigration in an economy summit? And we think not at all. We think it's an absolutely critical piece of our success moving forward.
Before we move on, Meg, did you want to add anything further to that, or have we more or less covered this subject?
I mean, I think we have. I don't know, Jen, do you have any words to say? I know you've been sort of picking up the reins here in our office with a lot of that kind of connecting work that's happened. I think we'll have really deep conversations at the summit about this. So I think that there's a lot of ways to look at it. So I think for now, I think we've covered it well, but come and get more, because we're going to go deep, on May 12th for sure.
Yeah, the only thing I would want to add to that, because there's so much detail, and it's like we could go all day on this, and so the summit is a great chance for that. I do just want to sort of keep putting out there that, so as Bill mentioned, like, this is another step in a long arc. That is what economic development strategic planning is all about. It's about a group of people getting together years ago and saying, okay, like, what our economy needs is people, and we're running out of them, and thus began conversations that have led to partnerships, that have led to attempts, that have led to funding, that have led to other attempts. And that's how we get here. We get here by basically paving the road ahead of ourselves, right? We don't, we look around, we look for a road, and sometimes it's not there. So then we have to build the road. And that's really what's been going on. So a related thing that I just want to, talk to, that is part of this, is that we have the Southern Vermont Economy Summit is an outward manifestation of a joint program that we do across both counties called the Southern Vermont Economy Project. And that is kind of an outward manifestation of our goals, ways to implement the regional plan and try to enact some of those get to those objectives. But, we have another one that's the Working Communities Challenge. So we have a Southern Vermont team, of which, BCRC and Jonathan and other folks are a part, that is about creating and supporting immigration systems. And so that's this Boston Fed Working Communities Challenge. There are 8 teams across the state, and ours is one of the later to come online. So we're just getting going on this, but this is, we have these big complicated initiatives, and sometimes it's confusing for people because they're like, what's going on? We're like, this is the way we build the road that we can then walk on to get to the thing we've all kind of, are trying to get to. So these things are all going along in parallel and interwoven and related, in the same way that broadband, which is the thing, we've had broadband connectivity breakfasts and things at the summit and standalone summits. And now here we are as a region helping each other and, implementing actual broadband, like putting wires, out there, right? So I think that's the part that people understand, but what I want people to constantly understand too is that leading up to that are these partnerships, these conversations, these collaborations. That's how we get to like building a thing.
So since you're talking about broadband, I'm terribly tempted to go to Jonathan Cooper and have him talk a little bit about broadband, because I know that's a subject near and dear to his heart. But Jonathan, well, you might want to work this into this next question. I noticed that the lunch keynote speaker is going to be talking about decriminalizing development. It's going to be Chet Clem of Lime Properties. So does development need to be decriminalized in Vermont? I mean, the subhead here, did your last planning board meeting feel like a parole board? Whoa, that's pretty heavy. What's Mr. Clem going to be talking about there with decriminalizing development?
Let it be known that prior to his work in real estate development, Mr. Clem had a managing editor position with The Onion source. So he's got a lot of levity baked into that gravity. And so I think that it's a good, that snippet is a really good sense of how approachable we're sort of making what's supposed to be, perhaps a somewhat a challenging topic. And maybe most of the time, the best way to get through a punch is to lean into it. And sometimes we have to, talk about things in a frank or somewhat surprising way. I think we all know that part of the legacy of local control that we've inherited in our Vermont communities is one where there's a lot of opportunities for participation. But one of the things that's surprising is that things can change without us noticing that they're changing. And then we are left with what is a different situation than we started with, while we maybe need to take a couple extra steps to realize that there's a change that's taking place and there's implications. And I would say to that as an example that there are 1,000 fewer people in Bennington than there were in 1990, but we have a housing crisis in Bennington. So what changed? And household sizes changed as an example of one thing that changed. And where we sometimes feel like when there's different ways or there's different kinds of change, and some of them are hard to see and some of them are a little easier to see, like a new building, and really getting a sense of how those different elements work together or what the interplay is there is one that I think Chet will be, has a really sort of masterful perspective in sort of giving us a sense of what it's like to be in amber. And some of the best places to not have change are cemeteries. But after that, there are places where people live in our town centers and our village centers in our residential neighborhoods. And as tempting as it is to sort of see something stoic and lasting, we don't have to go back to many generations to see that this has always been subject. Where we live, where our businesses are, where our lives take place, has always been in a state of flux. And the public process that governs that is a helpful way to prevent some sort of breakneck runaway activity. But what we're left with is still a process, is still something that shifts. And having a perspective like Chet's is one that sort of allows us to see where we are from the perspective of someone who's looking at us sort of from the outside in. And that can go a long way, we found in summit sessions in the past, in sort of helping us hear from someone who understands where a lot of these principles are and how they work together, but at the same time isn't someone that we're going to see at the post office the next day. And that sort of separation can sometimes be pretty helpful for these kinds of talks.
What have you been hearing from folks about how they are thinking of using those ARPA funds? And to the extent that we know what Katie might be talking about at the conference, because another point I think is also the rules have been liberalized somewhat since they were set a year or so ago. The game is a little bit different now, I think, but who wants to take that one on first?
Well, I'll take a crack, Andrew. And thanks for that. I think your kind of concluding point there about the change in the rules, which, you're referencing the final rule that came out. And, for the bulk of the time over the past year, municipalities and VLCT and the regional planning commissions and development corporations had been operating under the assumption that what was in the interim final rule with regard to the appropriate uses of funding was what was going to make it into the final rule. That didn't happen. What did happen was this liberalizing, as you noted, of the use of funds, so that up to $10 million communities could use basically for quote unquote basic government services. So that was much less restrictive than the prior rules, which required nexus to COVID, which required economic development projects, often in the water and sewer front. And, frankly, from my perspective, the importance of this panel is really encouraging municipalities to take a look and perhaps make the harder decisions of trying to use this money to do transformative things. That was going to be almost forced, and I don't want to use that in a negative way, but given the interim final rules, communities were almost going to be in a position of having to make these harder decisions to do that long-awaited water or wastewater infrastructure project, which may in fact require some additional funding sources, which may in some cases require cooperation with other communities. And, frankly, those of us in the planning world were pretty excited about trying to bring together those opportunities in those communities and make those linkages. So with the flexibility now, we're now relying upon communities to hopefully make the sometimes harder decision of trying to do these transformative things. So discussing how those things might come about from my perspective is an important part of that panel.
Okay, well, I can't let us go just yet until I give Jonathan an opportunity to talk about broadband. There was a very interesting article in VT Digger yesterday about the cost of some of the cabling and other equipment kind of rising with supply chain issues kicking in. Broadband, I think throughout each of these conferences that I've attended, has always been a major theme of conversation and building up stronger, more robust broadband. From your perspective, Jonathan, how is that looking right now?
I thought that the article in the Vermont Digger was a really great opportunity for us to say, thank goodness for communications union districts, that many of the partnerships that exist with the private sector that were unimaginable 10 years ago have taken shape throughout the state. Southern Vermont, Northwest, Memorial Fiber, some of the vanguards, EC Fiber, CV Fiber have been able to make tremendous headway. And, when we encounter adjustments, you might say through inflation, it is always the rural areas that see their gap grow the most, they get left the farthest behind. And for the state to be in the position that it's in, with communications union districts, in many instances, working together for bulk fiber purchases, working with other actors like the Vermont Community Foundation to enable those purchases, you really get a sense for how crucial their role has been in the last 2 years, not knowing what we would be walking into it anyway, and being able to point to across the state, thousands of and underserved residences being connected, hundreds here in the Southern Vermont area. It's been a remarkable run of kind of small successes that added to something big. Broadband was never going to be easy. That's why it wasn't happening. And so, now that there are volunteer boards, some of which are being able to acquire staff that are utilizing the resources that effectively, that are able to acquire staff to head up projects, it's a remarkable thing. It's not a surprising thing, though, that those things tend to happen in Vermont when we have the lead time, when we have the conversations, we get our frame of mind around what the problem is and how we'd like to solve it, and then doing so intentionally. So I was definitely heartened by the article, and to see that there are many different ways of approaching a problem, and we're seeing with the CUDs that flexibility from one to the next, and how they're going to work together, work independently, to square that circle.
Thank you all for making the time, for being with us. And well, I'll see you over there on May 12th. So, and my microphone will be hot. So anyway, we'll see you then. And thanks to all of you again for watching. I hope you found our program interesting, and well, we'll see you again the next time. Take care.